Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to be focusing on how to use some common audio effects: compression, equalization, and reverb, along with delay and echo time-based effects. These are commonly used in processing audio, and we'll be looking mostly at a post-production sense after it has been recorded, though of course there are roles for these to play during the recording process. We'll start with compression, which affects the volume or loudness of a piece of audio and is what is partly responsible for those movie trailer voices. In a world wide web, an ASMR artist has his brain replaced by AI, becoming the ASMR artist. Coming soon. Equalization affects different frequencies within the audio, emphasizing maybe the bass or the treble, and can also have effects where you hear the manipulation of the frequencies, like a wah-wah pedal. And lastly, reverb creates a sense of space. It is about the reflections of sound that convey the size and shape of a space to our ear. It can also be used for creating a certain vibe in recordings or creating echoey special effects, like if I wanted to make something more hypnotic. Now, each of these effects is an incredibly deep topic on its own, and the usage of them may vary depending on whether you're doing audio for video or producing music. So there's no way to cover the whole of this subject in this video. I'm going to focus on the basics, what these effects are, a little bit about how they work, the typical controls and parameters that you can influence when using them, and I will give some examples to help illustrate their use, but it's not going to cover a lot of specific applications because the topic is very broad. Once you get a feel for them, you should be able to dive deeper into learning specifics for the area that interests you. There are countless numbers of different hardware processors as well as software devices for each of these effect types. So can't go into all of that either, but the good thing is once you learn the basics of how they work, you should be able to understand and adapt to any specific device that you're using. So that is why I'm going to focus on fundamentals. There is a mighty windstorm happening, so you might hear howling wind in the audio. That is what that is. With that said, let us dive into our first topic, which is compression. And I'm going to be using both some video editing software, Adobe Premiere, and some music recording software, Reason, so you can see sort of some differences, different ways of looking at some of these effects, different options, and importantly, audio focused software may represent things a little bit differently than video focused software. So hopefully it covers a little bit of ground for you and gives you some exposure to these different avenues. Alright, so let's talk about compression. So as I said, compression affects the volume of an audio signal. And I'm going to start there because it is more straightforward. We're really only looking at the loudness of our audio and some things we can do to influence how we perceive that volume. So at a very basic level, I'm just going to draw a little snippet of a sound wave. And it looks something like this. And these higher peaks represent higher volume. This could be something like a piano, just that loud hit to start, and then kind of fades out with some sustain of the sound. So we have this loud hit and then a lower volume portion. Now we have a term for kind of the shape of a sound piece like this over time, which we call the envelope. You can kind of think of it as just that shape that this wave occupies. And we can kind of influence that shape. So in its simplest form, compression can make those louder parts quieter and the softer parts louder, meaning that there's less variation or dynamic range in the sound that you're hearing. So in this case, the loud part is quite loud and the soft part is fairly soft. With compression, we can make it so those aren't so far apart. You can think we kind of squash down this taller part of the wave. You can literally think about it as just turning the volume down when the sound gets loud and turning it up when it's quieter, so you get a more consistent volume. And under the hood, that's basically what a compressor does. A little bit more complexity and a few more functions as well. So let's take a look at a compressor in software so we can see what some of these parameters might be. You may hear some white noise, and you might also hear the fan of the computer running. Obviously, we're using some software that likes to use the processor, so I do apologize for the fan noise. Noise reduction is a complicated and imperfect subject. Some aspects of it can be addressed by the effects we're talking about. Probably won't really get into that too much because those are more advanced concepts and uses of these tools. So I have a snippet of audio, and you know that I like to start with the pure basics, just so we're not making too many assumptions about what people do or don't know. Actually, I have an audio of myself. Spend a lot of my time staring at a screen like this. And I'm just going to play this because I want you to look at the sound meter we have on the right side of the screen here. And these green bars correspond to how loud the playing sound is. So when they spike higher, that is a louder sound. When they're lower, that is quieter. This is a representation of volume. And this is expressed in decibels. So if we look at these numbers along the side, we go at the top, we're at 0, ending below 60 here. So this is from the quietest signal possible, basically no signal, to the loudest possible signal, which in this case is capped at the level 0. So decibels are a ratio unit. They're not an absolute unit. They have to be measured as a ratio towards something else. And it's on a logarithmic scale, which is part of why we use ratios. So what we're really looking at is the relative loudness of one thing to another. In air, we might measure decibels relative to the sound pressure level of air. So that is our relative comparison. The nice thing about working in an all-digital space like this is we really just have from the loudest possible to the lowest. And so references full scale. So we don't really have to worry too much about our reference point because we're just working within this band from the loudest possible signal we can produce to the lowest. So if you see decibels, to understand what they're really referencing, there needs to be additional info. You might see dBs or dBSPL. Those are reference to what that ratio is compared against. Don't want to go too deep there. It's just helpful to understand a little bit of how we're characterizing the volume of a given sound. Something that is 6 decibels louder than another sound is twice as loud in terms of what we hear. So if you look at this audio, it's kind of bouncing between -9 and -15 for how loud it is when I'm speaking. Okay?
You're going to place a bet on one
so meters like this help us give a reference point for how loud a sound is. But I do want to emphasize that all of the tools we're using should be tuned by ear. I can give you some guidelines, but your specific audio, the conditions of the recording, the room or space it was in, the character of the voices or the instruments, all these things are going to be slightly different. So you want to use your ear. The device you're using also will have its own characteristics. Could introduce artifacts or distortions. We want to listen for those things. Alright, so let's get back to compression. Typically, you'll see this referred to as a compressor. If we go to the amplitude and compression section of our effects, we're actually going to grab dynamics. This is control over the volume dynamics of the sound. So all this is, and part of why it's called dynamics here, let's open up our window, is that we have more than one tool used for controlling the volume in this effect. So we have an auto gate, expander, and limiter in addition to the compressor. We're going to focus on the compressor here. And I'm starting here in the video editing software because I think it's an easy way to see the main controls that we're talking about. Then we'll jump over to some audio software to look at how this is used in music. I think will be a clear example. So we have a threshold control, a ratio control, attack, release, and makeup. Really, makeup gain. So what are we talking about here? Well, a compressor could apply to the entirety of a signal that you feed it. But we don't necessarily want to do that. We might want to leave parts of the signal alone. In this case, we may just want to bring these peaks down and not really touch the rest of our signal. So we can set a threshold which says, don't engage the compressor unless the audio signal volume crosses that threshold. So let's set this to 0 dB. And let's play again. I will turn on my compressor.
They happen to be called player.
Where the signal is not hitting 0 dB ever. It's staying below 9.
Which do you think will win?
So this compressor won't do anything until we get down into that range. Okay? So it's not even trying to do any compression unless something goes above the threshold of the signal. And the lower we set this value, right, we're referencing 0 as our max, so we're going negative. If we set this to negative 40, right, everything I'm saying should be affected by that compressor. Now, we're not actually getting any change in the audio because we have not actually changed the setting which will affect how much we affect the volume of that signal. That we do through what is called the ratio control. And as I mentioned, we use ratios with sound because it simplifies a lot of things. But the simplest way to think about ratio is just how compressed do you want this to be? The higher the ratio, the more those louder peaks will be pushed down, and the more the volume will be made consistent. Just being louder and softer, higher ratio is going to bring those things together, less variation in volume. So right now the ratio is set to 1, so even when the compressor engages, it is still a 1-to-1 volume ratio between the signal coming in and the signal going out. As I turn this up, there will be more change in that output volume. Now, if I play, I've set the ratio, but there's no compressor action happening because I set that threshold back to 0 dB. So let's lower it down to where my voice will be affected by the compressor. So now you see in our meter up here that stuff is going on. And that happens when signal gets above the threshold that I set. And this is showing how much that compressor is operating. So with a ratio of 2, it is not an overly strong effect. But as we turn it up, there's more influence.
Yes,
and you'll probably hear a characteristic change in my voice at those higher levels.
But for now, we're going to focus on what you're most commonly.
See, the volume is smoothed out, but you can hear the effect happening at this point.
As I described for you, at heart, it is a very simple game. You're effectively betting on a
So in this case, the ratio is limited to 8. Audio software might have a higher ratio.
Or tie. Despite that being simple, there are kind of
Bring
two
it back down,
aspects
it lessens the
that make
effect.
more complex.
So we're going to do this on a piece of music to help see how it is affected. The voice compression might be more subtle. Let's look at the remaining controls before we do that. Attack is how fast the compression engages after a signal crosses the threshold. 1 millisecond is very fast, takes effect almost instantly. You might ask, don't I always want it to take place instantly? And the answer is maybe not. There are some sounds you might really want to control and not have them get through. There's other loud sounds you might want to have a chance to pass through so they can be heard before the effect comes in. There is also release, which is after it's been triggered. How long does it take to go back to being uncompressed? This is set at 50 milliseconds. This is something you'll tune with your material, whether it's a male or female voice. You might need a longer release time because it's going to correspond to the frequencies that you are hearing. So again, these are things you want to tune by ear. Faster attacks might have a distortion that you hear depending on your sound, things like that. One thing that might happen with a long release, if we made this really long, is that a loud sound will turn things down, but it will leave that volume down. That might be quite audible. We'll talk about a specific example of that a little bit later. We talk about multiband compressors. The last control is makeup gain. Alright, it's a volume knob. You can simply think of this as after the effect of compression, right, it is pushed down the louder parts of the wave. This made the signal seem quieter as a result. You may want to make it louder, and the makeup gain lets you do that. Like I said, it's kind of like turning up the volume after you've done your compression. It doesn't exactly work that way under the hood. That's the result you get. So let's play again. Let's set some pretty strong compression. That's what we'll look at next. And you see now this is keeping the audio at a lower level than it used to be. You can use that makeup gain to bring the volume back up. And I'm not doing this purposefully listening to it. I'm just demonstrating how to control works for you. So what does this allow us to do? If something had some loud peaks and the remaining signal was quieter, we can't turn this whole signal up, or it just makes these louder and they might clip or distort once they hit our maximum level. So if we can turn these down to make a signal that doesn't have such extremes, we can then turn the whole thing up, getting something a little more like this perhaps, where the relative volumes are closer together but the whole signal is louder. That's something that commercials or those movie voiceovers do to get that maximum impact. Alright, so let's switch over to an audio example in music. So I think that will be illustrative of how this effect works. I think you could probably start to see it there on the voice. Let's use a more obvious musical example. Alright, and here we are in Reason, which is a DAW, digital audio workstation. And I like Reason because it's pretty straightforward and easy to use. If you're starting out, Reaper has a free trial, and lots of people produce content with that, so there's lots of references for it. So that could be a good recommendation. So we're looking at a view of some audio tracks just to help orient you if you're not familiar with audio software. And we're going to be focusing on just this one guitar track for the moment. We also have a view that lets us see our audio output and has some effects like we are talking about. I'll touch on that in a moment. So if we play this, it's just some simple strumming of a guitar, and as you hear, it's pretty even in terms of the volume. There's not a lot of variation in volume. And let's grab this snippet now, and let's listen. You see how there's more rhythmic emphasis there every other beat? So we had this. Much more even strums. And here's some more pronounced rhythmic strums. Now you may want this effect in your music, or you might decide that you want to tone down that recording and get something that is more even like the other sample. It might also be the case that you simply had a player who was playing sort of inconsistently and you want to smooth out that performance a bit. So this is where we can use a compressor to reduce those variations in volume and make this one feel a little bit more like this one. Compression gives us some control over that. So let's play again just for reference. You see we have an audio meter here. This is the overall signal. That's the individual track. And you'll note this has a reference from 0 down to the lowest volume like we're used to looking at. And it also has a different scale here that goes up to 12. As I mentioned with audio levels, referencing decibels, you really need a reference point, and working entirely in digital keeps things simple. But if you're an engineer who's having to deal with the analog side of things, there are some more complexities. I'm not going to get into that. Just want to give a little orientation as to why you're seeing some different demarcations here. But we can see from this track is kind of hitting maybe about 20, bouncing up to around 15 on those more emphasized portions. So let's go ahead and add a compressor. Alright, and so we have this more studio style compressor compared to that software realization we had in Premiere. See, this is modeled as a rack unit, a physical device. But we'll see that we basically have the same controls to work with a couple extras. We have input gain, which is basically just volume coming into the compressor. We won't worry about that. We can again set our threshold, the point where we want the compressor to kick in. We can control the ratio, and you'll see on this studio compressor, the ratio goes up much higher than what we had available in Premiere. And if I play my track, again, you can see the volume of the track, and we are getting a little bit of compression. Thresholds around minus 18 dB, and there's a 4:1 ratio already set. So this is already doing something for us. We're not going to talk about sidechain compression. That is a whole other topic, especially relevant to music production. And you see again we have controls for attack and release. And then we have a button called adapt release, which really the software is going to try to choose a release time based on the actual music that you were feeding it. So it could be an interesting function. And then an output gain, which we can really think of the same as the makeup gain in Premiere. If our overall signal has gotten quieter, we can boost it back up. And then the last thing is soft knee. We've thought about compression as kicking in right at the threshold. But the soft knee makes it basically more of a gradual onset of the compression once you get to that frequency. What I told you was that when the compressor reaches the threshold, it starts reducing that volume. Right? And the ratio kind of governs how much it does. Okay. So if we plot our input volume versus our output volume, it's going to be 1-to-1 up until we hit our threshold value. Then the compressor kicks in and it's going to have less volume for a given input. And how much less will be governed by the ratio. In my beautifully drawn chart, this happens immediately at that frequency. However, when we say soft knee, what we're saying is don't make that change immediate. Kind of blend into making that change. So you get more of a curve rather than an immediate effect at your threshold. Don't have to worry too much about that. Think of it as a soft knee might give you a chance to have a smoother onset of compression rather than feeling it hit right away. And that's something you'll want to listen for. And like in Premiere, if we don't want the effects of the compressor, we can go to bypass. If we go to off, it actually stops the sound from passing through. This is bypassed. This is on. So if you listen, you'll probably already hear some of the effects of the compressor. See how when I turn it on, that rhythmic emphasis is already decreased. So let's hear it without. Boom, ba, boom, ba. And then when we turn it on, it's still there, but it has been lessened. So let's turn the threshold down a bit and get more influence over that. And here without. So you see what the compressor has done is it's squashed those sounds that are above the threshold frequency, reducing their relative volume in accordance with the ratio. So those louder boom, ba, are made less loud. And that allows us to control the feel of that guitar part. Gets us closer to that more steady strumming. So let's go ahead and hear that with an increase in ratio. a lower ratio. See, as we turn up that ratio, we're squashing them down more, so we get less variation in the volume. I'm going to go ahead and turn down the attack a bit so it comes on quicker. And again, this is something you want to tune by ear. You might hear some crispiness or artifacts. The attack is too fast. You just want to really make sure you're listening to the characteristics of the sound to get the effect you want. And then let's turn the release time down. When we have a longer release time, it can leave that volume suppression on longer. It might dampen other sounds depending on your settings. Let's just listen. Right, and the effect can be pretty subtle depending on what you're listening to. So again, just use your ears for what feels right for the music. Different frequencies of sound may want different release times. A male voice might want a slower release time than a female voice, for example. And then you can also use adaptive release. Let's hear that just to see what the effect might be. So, to my ears, it sounds like it's using a little bit of a longer release time. And then, as we looked at in Premiere, we can then increase the final volume with that output gain. So what have we gotten out of this? This was a sound sample that was just kind of an even strumming. And this was the sound sample that had more volume variation, but we have compressed it to have less volume variation. We've brought the overall volume level up. So in a way, we've increased its relative loudness overall, because when you have those high peaks of sound, you can only make those so loud, but the rest of the part is going to be quieter. You want the whole thing to be louder. Compression can bring the different volumes closer together, and you can increase the volume of the whole part. And this is a common technique in music production to get parts at the volume that engineer and mixer want them to be at. Now, I've mentioned that we're mostly looking at post-production audio here. So applying these effects after something has been recorded. But there are cases where you may want to use them during the recording process. This is a guitar amplifier plugin that also includes some effects, reverb and echo, which we'll look at soon, but also some guitar pedals. And one of these is a compressor pedal. Some guitarists will use them as they are playing. For instance, if you wanted maybe like a poppy kind of rhythmic country part, but you want the volume to be nice and even, it's helpful to have that compression so you can get that effect while you are playing. And it helps to have it as you are playing, because guitarists will use these responding to the effects as part of the playing versus something that's added later. So simple kind of controls the amount of compression, which is kind of like ratio, volume, mix, and some modification of EQ. It'll depend on your compressor pedal. Many just have a single knob with a bunch of fixed parameters underneath. So we're not really going to focus on that, just highlighting that there are cases where you might use these effects as part of your recording process, but they're also powerful tools to be used once you have recorded something. And so that's the power that a compressor can offer you to help shape that sound musically in something like this, or if you're doing a video, recording someone speaking, and their volume is varying a lot, you want to make that more consistent, or if you just want to make it more affected and punchy, like that voiceover announcer, it gives you the tools to do so. So let's jump back over to the video software to look at something else for just a moment. Alright, so let's play our unaffected audio. I will indicate which hand has won, and we'll pay out bets accordingly. And let's turn on our compressor. Say the player hand won, it's paid 1-to-1. And I've set this very aggressively with a high ratio. The banker hand, it is a fairly low threshold, 1-to-1. But see how you definitely hear the effect? It's a pretty noticeable application. I hit it pretty hard, and that's when you want to use your ear. So, particularly if your goal is something that still sounds more natural. Make your bet and be playing. So let's hear the unaffected. Of course, and listen to that background when I turn on the compressor. Explain all that. But I hope that showcases a key aspect of Baccarat for you, which... Do you notice how that background hiss gets louder when I turn on the compressor? Right? We've made louder sounds quieter and quieter sounds louder, which lifts the volume of that background noise. So while we may have desired the vocal quality change from the compression, it can bring out those quieter sounds, including that noise that we hear. So this is why it's important to listen to the effects and understand the impact that you're having. And this can be a solution that is sometimes compromised or doesn't do everything that you need. Now I want to take a quick moment to look at a different approach to compression. As I mentioned, if you have a loud sound that triggers the compressor, based on the release time, you may keep other elements quieter after that compressor kicks in. Well, there was a problem with this in the real world with disco music. In the late 70s, it became popular. It was a form of music that had a strong beat. Every quarter note had a strong beat, and engaging the radio station compressors would change the volume of music that came after. So you kind of got this pumping volume sound, which wasn't great. But if you dampen that too much, you lose the feel of the rhythm in that music. A lot of these tools, compression, equalization, in many cases weren't developed as effects, but more to solve practical problems. Engineers needed to send signals down physical wires or through radio transmission, or then also maybe later had legal limitations. They needed these tools to help control and shape the signal. Well, a solution that was built for the disco music problem was a multiband compressor. Let's have a look at that. And it is the exact same concept as compression as we've been looking at it. But instead of working on the signal as a whole, the signal is broken up into frequency bands, and then individual compression is applied to each of those bands. So we have a low frequency, the deepest notes of voices, fundamentals of music or drums, a mid-range, an upper mid-range, and then finally a high range. So let's look at our original signal. This is raw audio. I don't like to apply effects to my voice for ASMR, but it is a bit bass heavy, and that can affect some of the compressed sound. So if we turn on our multiband compressor,
so this is a game of chance, because your only action is.
We have some more aggressive compression
Actually played though, so you can
on the bass part of the sound. You'll see it's the one getting most compressed and a little bit here, and basically none up in these upper ranges. So it gives us more control on which parts of our sound, or in this case our voice, are being affected by compression. Attack and release may vary based on those frequencies, right? A little bit longer in the bass, longer sound waves, lower frequency.
As I said, the dealer is going to handle all of the work.
And
that is what I will explain.
If you listen to this, okay, so let's hear that with the multiband compressor.
Playing Baccarat. Of course, it is more interesting if you know what's going on, so I'm going to explain all that.
And without.
But I hope that showcases a key aspect of Baccarat for you, which this is a game of chance. It is not a game of skill. Your only actions as a player are to bet whether
and let's compare that against the other
or
compression we had.
Or if they will tie, which pays out 8-1, but that's a much riskier bet.
And the original
so this
audio.
Is a game of chance, because your only action is to bet.
Multiband compression.
So let's talk about how it's actually played.
You hear that there's not quite as much of emphasis of that background hiss with the multiband. So we're applying compression less in the frequency range where that is occurring. So in a way this can be a more surgical tool for some applications.
So this is
so
what
with
you will most
multiband compression
commonly find if you walk into a casino
and
in
without
the US and really in many places around the world at this point. It's very specific.
I actually do like the sound of the multiband compression for this. Definitely let me know in the comments below if you prefer the compressed sound or the original raw mic sound for the ASMR video. Multiband compression, as I mentioned with disco music, is particularly useful when it comes to music and gives audio and mix engineers lots of control over sound and is heavily utilized in modern music production. Alright, so that is compression. I hope you have a better understanding of how this control can change the relative volume of sounds and give you more control over the dynamics, the loudness of your audio. We're not going to talk about it here, but there is the opposite concept, which is the expander, which will make quieter sounds quieter and louder sounds even louder. Basically a compressor in reverse. Now that we understand a little bit about compression and the dynamics of a sound, let's look at equalization, which focuses more on the balance of frequencies or pitches within your audio. Equalization is a potentially very powerful tool, both to solve problems and to work creatively with a piece of audio. It's powerful because it allows us to increase the volume of or decrease the volume of different frequencies within an audio signal, frequencies or pitches. Low frequency being low pitch, high frequency being higher pitches. So it is extremely useful for controlling the level of sound happening in different frequency ranges in your recorded audio or a piece of music. It can be instrumental for removing problem audio that you've recorded, maybe excess bass. And for music producers, it's essential for being able to shape the sonic palette and situate different instruments within your overall audio mix. So let's dive in, and I think this is one that is easiest to visualize by just looking at the frequency spectrum of some audio, and we'll dive into the details. So again, I'm going to show you an example in Premiere. It's well visualized, and then we can jump over and see a similar thing in our audio software. Alright, so again, we've got our same clip.
Just hand one or hand two.
And let's go ahead, go to our filter and EQ section, and we're going to add a parametric equalizer. You can see there are a variety of different equalizers. If you think about a graphic equalizer on a stereo system, allows for control over certain frequency bands, but we're going to use some tools that are a little more high precision than something that you might find on like a home stereo. So let's open up the window for this parametric equalizer. Really, when we say parametric, it's going to let us control different parameters. We're going to look at those: frequency, gain, Q, etc., and help you understand what we're talking about with those. So first, let's just play our audio and get a handle on what we're looking at.
And which do you think will win?
When I play the audio,
You might put your money
right, you're seeing this graph of the frequencies.
All bets are in.
And it's showing you how much
deal out
energy or volume content
cards each,
is at a given frequency.
card hand, depending on a certain
Right, from our lowest frequencies, which are extremely low pitch sounds, to super high frequency sounds.
Accordingly.
So you see there's a decent amount here happening around 100 hertz. There's a fair amount here, and then we do have
If you bet the
a
bank,
decent amount of frequency up into the high frequencies, and some of that is that hiss that you hear in the recording.
keep track. So all you're doing.
So let's stop for a moment. So the human ear can hear up to about 20 hertz. Some people can hear a little bit higher, most people less. That's extremely high frequency, and if we got rid of all of this, you may not notice much difference. Can affect the character of the sound. Modern music is pretty energetic across the spectrum, but you'll notice as a result, this covers the range of human hearing, so 20 hertz is the max, 20 kilohertz is the max, but the middle of the scale is not 10 kilohertz, it is 1 kilohertz. And this is actually a good representation. A lot of video editing software, particularly in the old days, just put 10 in the middle, which isn't helpful because frequencies that we hear, like the volume, kind of are governed by ratio. So 20 hertz to 1 kilohertz covers the same frequency range as 1 kilohertz to 20 kilohertz. I mean, that's counterintuitive. We have to think about the multiplication part of it. Again, I could probably dive deeper to explain that in more depth. But the key part of it is this kind of evenly distributes the range of pitches, and most of what we're going to be worried about and hearing is going to be more in this middle of the chart rather than at the ends. So right now, all this is doing is just visualizing the frequency content of our sound. We're not doing any equalization or adjustments to the frequency content of our sound. Okay? So down here is our low frequency content, and up here is our high frequency content. So now let's take a look at the tools of this equalizer that can be used to manipulate the frequency content that we have. And we're going to start with a high pass and low pass filter. It's kind of a basic way to start understanding how we manipulate frequency. Right now, this blue line represents changes to what the incoming signal will be, and it's flat. We're not doing anything. But if we use a high pass filter, and maybe confusing terminologically, that happens in the low frequency spectrum, but we're letting higher frequencies pass through. We're essentially removing lower frequencies or lower pitches. We let higher pitches pass through, but don't let lower pitches pass through. So what are we effectively doing? We're taking away bass content from our signal. So let's hear that. Knowing that, you could walk up to the table in the casino, make your bet, and be playing baccarat. So this is unaffected. Of course, it is more interesting if you know what. And you might hear a little bit of change there, but we're still in very low frequencies, even though there's a decent amount of bass content in my voice. So this is a game of chance. This is a filter. It basically has some fixed traits for how much it removes frequencies. Are to bet whether the player hand and the banker hand. We can decide how much of it we remove, which is how much gain we take away. So let's do the max. In this case, it's 15 decibels of reduction. And let's increase the frequency. And as I do, you should hear more and more bass content removed from the sound. I want to be clear. You hear that? And now that we're up at 100 hertz, with the effect extending up to 200 or 300 hertz, we hear a lot less of the bass content that we're hearing. This is what you will most commonly find. Right here we hear a lot more lower frequency content. The U.S. And as I bring it up, that goes away. We're hearing more of the higher pitch content. Very specific. Let's keep going. As I said, the dealer is going to handle all of the work. As we get up, that is what I will explain because that towards 1,000, we're taking a lot of the lower end out of my voice. I can keep going. As such, we're just going to call it baccarat. Now, if there's many baccarat, is there baccarat? We're taking out more and more of the sound the higher we go. And later in the video, I will get into that. But for now, we're going to focus on what you're most commonly going to encounter. Now, as I described for you, so here we've just taken out some of the lowest frequencies. And in music, this might be common to take out bass for almost all the instruments except the bass or the bass drum. to help isolate those sounds, make sure they're punchy and not obscured by other instruments, and then emphasize the frequencies of those other instruments where they have the most impact. So that is our high pass filter. We have the same concept of low pass filter. We get rid of high frequencies and allow low frequencies to pass through.
Really betting on a coin toss.
So we start
Whether
taking
the
out some
player
upper end hits,
or the banker hand will win.
and we get more and more shift to bass in my voice.
Being simple, there are kind of two aspects that make Baccarat more complicated in its feel. The first is how it is scored.
So it's just
And that's
like
what we'll look at.
the high
next.
pass filter, but it
And
gets
then
rid of
How
frequencies on the upper end.
Dealt.
So the low pass and the high pass filter are ways to affect frequencies either lower or higher than that threshold. And we can decide the threshold frequency and how much to filter, right, down to this minus 15 decibels. But the shape of this is constrained by the software. They've determined a curve for it. There is a setting in this piece of software to change that. So we get a shallower roll off of the frequency here, or we can go back to this one, which is steeper. Right, but those filters have a specific purpose to either discard lower frequencies or higher frequencies, and we don't have as much control over them. Let's look at one of our other options. So you'll see these numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And what this basically gives us is 5 different settings of equalization, generally targeting different ranges of the sound. And with each of these, we could increase the amount of that content at that frequency or remove it. So let's look at an example of one of these. But we really could choose a bunch of different frequencies to alter with a tool like this, and you may want to do so given your audio. So each of these allows us to specify the frequency it's going to impact, basically a center value. And you see it then slopes up and then down. So it's going to affect frequencies around that center value. How much gain we apply to those specific frequencies, whether it's a lot or a lot of reduction or just a little. And then we can also change the shape of this, and we'll look at that in just a moment. We do that with Q or width. So EQ is used to isolate specific frequencies to the best of the software's capability and allow us to change how much of that frequency is present. So let's look at that. And the best way I find to identify what frequency you're looking at is to turn it up first so you can hear it, and then you can set it where you want it to be. So let's play our sound. And let's take this one and boost its frequencies.
Non-obvious if you don't know what's going on.
So you hear the piece of audio that's being emphasized there. And let's move the frequency around to hear that.
The game is for a hand
Right here, it's lifting more of the bass.
as possible.
And then we get higher in pitch.
Hand of 9 will beat a hand of 8.
Right, this is a much higher frequency range versus down here. So you can see how this is emphasizing different pitches within our audio
Now,
based on where we set it.
Think of blackjack where your goal
Here,
is to
a lot of
get
that
as
high
close as you
frequency
can.
noise.
Feels similar. But
And here you may not hear as much effect because this is in the upper ranges of many people's hearing.
as possible in Bach.
Here it's very bassy.
If someone tells correct,
So let's say
because the only possible score.
one common thing you might find if you record particularly at home is there's frequencies in here that can make a room sound kind of boxy.
For a hand, a 2-card or a 3-card hand,
Maybe not the
Card
most
0
pleasant
through
sounds.
9. And I'm going to explain how we get to that.
So let's try taking
It's
those
really
out.
not too complicated, but it does take some explanation.
Take out more of the bass.
So when it comes to scoring,
And again, this is something you want to listen to by
pieces
ear
are low
to
in
get the
Bach
sound quality that you're looking for.
as 1. Cards
Maybe a
2
slight reduction, a slower
through
range.
9, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
You could also use this potentially
Cards 2 through
to help
9
increase intelligibility of vocals, finding areas where different
an 8
vowels
is
or consonants are
8
emphasized.
in the tally. Now, when it comes to the 10, as well as the Jack,
See, this becomes more muffled,
Queen, and King,
maybe not as clear.
these 4 cards, the 10 through the King, 10, Jack, Queen, King, these all count as 0 when adding up the total of the hand. Now, some baccarat players might
Now,
be
the
raising
other
their
thing
hands
we
right
can
now.
control
I'm gonna
is
talk a
the
little bit
width,
more
which is called
about
Q.
the scoring of
It can be
those
really the
in
shape of this curve.
Just know,
You can make it
if you
much
think of these
narrower and be
cards as
more
0, 10,
precise in which
13,
frequencies we're
then
affecting.
you will be just fine when it comes to calculating.
Now, you also want to listen with your ear because depending on the software or device you're using,
Ace counts for 1.
changing Q might
2 through
introduce
9
artifacts in
have
the
their
sound.
face value. 10, Jack, Queen, King. We're all going.
Here we're
to
kind of
do
hearing
0.
a particular form of
Fairly
hiss at this
straightforward.
frequency.
There's one more.
We might try to
key
take
scoring
that out
detail for a hand.
and hear less
in
of it.
baccarat.
Here it does affect the voice a bit though.
If your total of the 2 or 3 card hand
Here there's quite a bit
is
of
a
hiss across this range.
2-digit number, i.e. any total,
And vice versa, we could make this much wider
the
and
10
affect a much wider range of frequencies.
digit of the
But
number.
we probably want to be a little more surgical.
A hand at a 7 and
Oh.
8.
Parametric equalizer like this gives you control over those parameters
Greater than
so you can shape the sounds that you want to affect with minimal effect on the rest of the sound.
So this
I hope that makes sense. But the power of a tool like this is you might want to cut out some boxiness in your room. You might identify an area where it helps intelligibility, where you want to boost a little. You may want to take out some high frequency that's kind of distracting noise.
a 5.
And you may want to just
Similarly,
lower bass content
9.
so the signal overall is not so
and a
bassy.
4, 13.
And you could do this with
We
multiple
drop the
versions of
10 digits,
individual
so we
tools,
just
but
have
have the power to affect a number of different sounds
so that
within
is
the
how we
same
end up
tool.
with scores
But
from
again,
0
always
to
use
9
your ears
in baccarat.
to make sure you're not having negative impacts
Mathematically,
from any of these changes as well.
10 of the total. Right, so if you have 6 and 5, that's 11. 11 modulo 10 is 1.
And that is just
I
an
know
example of
it's
how
much easier to do
equalization works.
modulo rather than just dropping the first digit.
You'll see and hear there are different forms of equalizer. Parametric tools are usually going to be your best bet. So they're going to be fully featured rather than having fixed choices for what frequencies you affect. You might also find individual high pass and low pass filters that could be used on their own rather than part of the parametric equalizer. Now let's take a look in our audio software for a little bit different look on equalization. Okay. Alright, so here we are back in Reason, and this time I want to look at a synth patch. We have the Pigments synth here from Arturia, extremely powerful modern synthesizer, many sound creating and shaping options. And I've loaded up this kind of Blade Runner-ish patch so we can talk a little bit more about equalization. I just have a little snippet here. Let's listen to, and I want you to listen for the different characteristics of this sound. So without looking at this sound in the equalizer, just picture what you're hearing, right? There's a pretty strong bass. There's this nice strong character to the sound. You're kind of like a hissy noise that comes in. And then on the sustain, you kind of get that extra high frequency content. So let's go ahead and open up the equalizer. And now let's play again and see what the frequency content of this looks like. Alright, so we see some strong bass. There's a lot going on in here. And you see as those notes sustain, you got a lot of ramp up here in the higher frequency range. So why I chose this particular patch is it shows an instrument which is actually putting out lots of frequency content all the way across the range, really the full range of the audio spectrum. So it's a really awesome patch. It has a lot of body and oomph from the bass and character from those higher frequencies coming in. So that may be exactly what you want, or it might be competing with other elements in your track. And EQ can help manipulate the sound, kind of free up those other elements. So, like we saw in Premiere, this is configured pretty similarly. You can have a low pass filter, which is going to chop out high frequencies, allowing low frequencies to pass through the filter. And similarly, a high pass filter, which will cut out low frequencies. So because this has so much bass content, one, we might rely on that for our bass sound, or we might want to make room for actual bass or bass drum. So we could reduce that bass frequency. We still get all that great sonic character, but we're not adding lots of booming bass to the track otherwise. We could cut more aggressively. We just get more trebly sounds. And another instrument could be the bass here. Similarly, it might be the high frequencies we want to trim. Alright, remember these notes, we get a lot of that. Could dial that back so those don't come in as aggressively. So this is a sound where we've taken out some of the bass and some of that high frequency, getting more of the kind of main sonic character. But maybe it's missing a little bit of that kind of brassy brightness that makes the sounds. We don't want to go too aggressively there. So this is very similar to what we looked at with the voice, using EQ to get rid of frequencies we don't want. We also have the same capacity to edit different parts of the sonic spectrum with these different individual EQ bands. So we could emphasize different frequencies. Kind of a nasally sound in this range. Or if there's very specific frequencies we wanted to take out, we could do so. And so we can also adjust our Q value or our width, get a broader reduction or a narrower one, so it doesn't go super narrow. Now, with a more narrow Q, we're emphasizing kind of a single frequency area. And if we move this back and forth, we get basically a wah-wah sound, like a guitar wah-wah pedal, which you probably heard in rock music. A little watery, kind of nasally, and that's all a wah pedal is it emphasizes a narrow band of frequency, and the pedal lets you move what frequency you're affecting. So EQ can be used as an effect like that, as well as if either dealing with problems or emphasizing different parts of the track. You know, if there was a vocalist, you might want to take out some of the frequency energy in the range of the voice, so the voice would stand out more. Could be another typical use for EQ. Really lets you kind of free up space in your sonic spectrum to balance the different elements of the mix. The guitar, vocal, piano, bass, or bass drum. And it's a very powerful tool for music production in that sense. Okay, so this representation is very much like what we saw in Premiere. Exactly the same tool. Now let's go over to our mixer view, and I just want to point this out to you. We won't spend a lot of time here, but in a recording studio with a mixing console, these effects are often part of the equipment in the console. So you see these blue, green, and red dials and these orange dials. You'll notice those match what we see here. So this is a digital representation of what would be physically represented on the console here. So you have the same controls, right? This is a lower frequency range. You can adjust what frequency, how much it's increasing or decreasing the signal, and the width of your Q value. So we see that this is how you might see it physically represented on a device in a recording studio. Same with our low pass and high pass filters. Is it on? And what frequency is it affecting? And again, this is something you would do by ear. You can cut a lot of that bass out, bring it back in, cut out the high frequency. You'll see in this software, these are directly linked, so we're just adjusting these values, but through the console. So a more modern software view, a much more traditional recording console version. And actually the same applies for the compressor. This is a master compressor affecting the entire recording, but again represented here. You can set threshold, ratio, tack release, and our makeup gain. Just some more traditional versions of these tools. And on that note, we'll just take one more quick look at another piece of physical gear. Like our compressor, this is modeled as a studio rack unit. And again, has parametric equalization. We can control the width, the gain, and the frequency. Let's go ahead and engage this. And show the gain. We can change our Q value. And with a tool like this, we can go quite narrow, so it can potentially be a lot more surgical than the other tools we were looking at. So the one thing we don't get with this tool though is the visualization. We're just seeing the values of these parameters and what they would be affecting. We don't actually see the sound wave. So again, a more traditional tool, but you might find things represented this way. Again, the controls work in just the same way. One other quick note, there's another type of EQ effect. It's called a shelving equalizer, and it's very similar to what we've looked at previously. Let's go ahead and make an adjustment. And so this, it really just means it has a different shape, where the shape is literally more like a shelf. So let's bring frequency up. I can see that. All this is doing is saying, instead of making a peak like this, just lift everything below me, but in kind of a linear way. So all of these sounds are basically being lifted the same. So it's kind of like the high pass filter where it had a fixed shape that decreases sound according to that shape. Again, this has a fixed shape determined by this unit, but it'll just lift or reduce everything in this even way instead of sloping it off completely like a filter might. So just a different kind of shape of curve for you to affect your sound. If you just say wanted to lower all of those bass frequencies, we have a high shelf. Just want to lift everything here a little bit. So again, you might have specific uses for that, but I just wanted to call it out as a slightly different way to influence a set of frequencies. But we're not going to worry too much about that. Focus more on our high pass and low pass filters and our ability to dial in specific frequencies to boost or reduce them. Alright. So that is a look at equalization in audio software. So to have a little bit of fun, let's look at a use of equalization to create an effect. I'm just going to go ahead and clear this out and add a fresh one on here just so it's less complicated starting point. So as I mentioned, things like EQ and compression were in many cases in aid of managing physical technologies. And so things like old telephones actually had a pretty sort of narrow bandwidth in terms of what you would hear. And so if you were trying to make it sound like someone is calling on an old telephone, you could use EQ to take out those frequencies that you wouldn't hear over the telephone line. So basically we're going to have a high pass filter. We bring this all the way up to around 400 hertz. And let's do our low pass filter, bring that down around 3.5 hertz. It's a pretty narrow frequency range. Why? Because it was used for speech. So you could limit the signal to that which contained the main energy of human speech.
Correct way to think about it. But all we do is if we have 2 digits in the number, we drop that first.
Right, here's what it sounds like normally.
Right, if we have a 10 and an 8,
And here we're only hearing
0.
a limited frequency
We
range.
just have an 8.
Got a lot quieter
In Bach,
if we didn't take all of that out.
An 8 or a 9. That is called a natural.
Just so we can
play
hear
will
it.
stop at that point. If
You can
both
hear
hands have a natural, then the higher one wins.
We've narrowed the
A 9
quality,
would beat an 8.
narrowed the
If
frequency
they were
range,
tied,
changing the
nine
quality
simply
of my
a tie.
voice.
But if there is a natural, there is a
And then
winner declared
What
at
if we
that
turn
point,
that
or a
compressor
tie,
back on?
and no further cards are dealt? So 8 and 9 are natural in Bach.
Because there was some compression
Alright.
accompanying this
So
to help clearly
let's do a quick
transmit
review
the voice
of
sounds at an
the score.
appropriate
I
level.
wanna dive in a little bit, but I
So you
think
could
it
play
will
with the
prepare
exact
you,
settings
not
here,
in case of some
but
confusing
using
things that you might encounter
EQ
out there.
to take out those
So we're gonna
frequencies
get a little bit more
and a little
complicated,
bit of
but I'm gonna remind you
compression
that it's
is
simple
going to
again,
give
so
you
just
the sound of talking on an older telephone. So that's a creative use if you wanted to represent that in a video. Can be used to solve problems by taking out too much bass or certain areas that have noise in them that you could de-emphasize. So it can be a very powerful tool and can be used in a million ways beyond what I've covered here. All right, the last effect we're going to cover today is reverb. And as I mentioned, echo, delay, reverb. These are all kind of related ideas. And they're about sound basically repeating itself. It's probably simplest to start with echo as a concept. We're all familiar if we like stand on a canyon and yell, our voice will get reflected back to us. Echo, echo, echo. Right? The reflection of what we say bouncing off the wall of the canyon and coming back to us is what we hear as echo. And with echo, reverb, delay, these are all things that I think you know it as soon as you hear it, even if you didn't have the word for it. So echo is pretty obvious. It's a sound where we hear the first sound and then we hear that sound repeated again. And we don't even need an effects tool like one of our software programs or a delay pedal that a guitarist might use. If we have a sound, this beautiful sound that I've drawn, maybe it's a hand clap, we could simply make a copy of that sound, paste it on another track, and play those, and now instead of hearing one clap, we'll hear two with the echo just by manually repeating that sound. Now our delays and echoes help us do that automatically and with control over the nature of that. They may let us control how many times we hear that echo. They may let us change the volume of each additional echo so they get quieter. They may also let us change if each one sounds exactly the same as the first one, or if it has been changed or modified in some way. So the earliest ways of doing this involved literally recording the sound to tape and then playing that tape. And each time it played, it would change a bit due to the physical nature of the device. So echo and delay might be defined differently depending on who you talk to. I might generally say that delay refers to repeats that are shorter in terms of when they occur relative to the original sound, and as that distance gets longer and longer, it becomes more like echo. However, I would suggest that there's maybe not a meaningful difference between the two in a practical sense, because the conceptual idea is the same. Different people may define them differently. Since I have one book reference that has a very different perception. And then manufacturers also call the same tools by different names. A delay unit from one manufacturer might be called an echo from another manufacturer, even though they do the same thing. But the general concept there is just a discrete repeat of the sound, whether that's singular or recurring, and whether it's identical or changing over time, okay? Don't think it's worth splitting hairs there. Reverb is a little bit different concept, and it's really more of a continuous smear of sound rather than all of those discrete repeats. But again, that's a little bit of a generalization. Reverb is, of course, short for reverberation, the bouncing of sound off different surfaces, and your ear hearing, sort of total accumulation of all of those bounces. Some of them might be heard as echoes, it is true. That's why I say these things blur together. But generally with reverb, we're talking about a combination of those sounds that gives that feel of a space. You'll hear reverb if you go to a nice concert hall. Give that beautiful warmth and some sustain to the sound, but not muddy things up either. And so generally reverb creates a texture to the sound rather than feeling as obviously a repeat as something like delay. And some do this in a very simple way, and some very specifically model physical spaces to generate the reverberated sound. Say you go to a concert where you're hearing someone sing, and when they sing a note, it's going to come to you and your ear will hear that. But at the same time, the sound waves that radiate out from their mouth may bounce off the floor, the ceiling, the walls, bounce off the rear wall of the stage, and then travel to your ear. So your ear is hearing all of that original sound, as well as that which reflects off of all of those surfaces. So that reverberation is what gives us the feeling, tells our ear what kind of space that we're in. It also gives a beautiful warmth to that sound. On the flip side, the place could sound echoey. It could have certain ugly frequencies emphasized in those reflections. So we have some parameters over that sound to give us generally a beautiful sound. It also helps us recreate ambiance of a space. So it's generally a creative tool, but it could be practically used if you have to record some dialogue after you've filmed a scene on location, and you'll need to apply some reverb to make it feel like it was recorded in that space. Otherwise our ear will hear it as being separate from that scene. So as I said, it's pretty easy to hear this rather than talk about it. Of course, I was yakking on and on, but let's actually hear some examples. And I will turn to my trusty jazz master, and we can play some things that I think will reveal to you quickly these types of sounds. Go with one of my trusty Paisley guitar picks. Okay, so now I am set up with just a guitar amp simulation. We're no longer in our audio editing software, as we're just going to be focused on these effects in the context of this guitar rig. And so we have an amplifier, and we're going to focus on these echo and reverb units. So right now I just have a clean sound. Don't really have any effects on it. And I think it's most straightforward to start with echo, as I think we all understand that concept. And we'll just be looking at it in the context of audio production. As I mentioned, right, you can see this is called an echo unit. Then it mentions delay time. A lot of manufacturers will use these interchangeably. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the echo unit, and let me just hit a chord here. Right, so we got a repeat of the sound. It is that simple. All an echo is, or a delay, is after the initial sound, after a certain delay of time, we hear the sound again. Right? And so we can adjust the time, how long it takes for us to hear that. You see how that is happening very soon after the initial sound, like right away, and we didn't even really hear it when I said it here. Almost at the same time. Let's get it so we can hear it. Right, so we're getting a distinct repeat of the sound. So that's a little bit longer. And one control you'll often see, particularly around music software, is whether you're just literally adjusting the time in a free fashion, or whether you are doing it as increments of a specified tempo. So here we could tap the tempo of our song. Right now it's set for 120. And since this is in this tap mode, where it is locking to divisions of the song, when we adjust the time, it is giving us relative beats in that tempo. So half, versus a quarter. And if we put that in free mode, right, instead we see milliseconds. And we're adjusting that time directly. So right, that might be something you're wanting to do by ear, or if you want a precise recording, you may want to lock it to the tempo and know exactly where your delay is going to fall. Someone like The Edge from U2 is famous for doing that. So we've adjusted time. We can also adjust how many times it repeats. Typically, that is going to be expressed as what is called feedback. So if we turn that up, right, it keeps feeding the delay back in and repeating itself. Right, if we turn this all the way up, may literally go on forever. So we have control over how long it takes to hear and how many times we hear it. We can also control the mix volume, how loud those repeats are. Right, so those are louder, here they're quieter. And this allows you some control over the tonality affecting whether you're cutting bass or treble frequencies. There's a couple other controls here, tape drive and tape mod. Since I mentioned the earliest effects often used a literal spool of tape that they were recording to, that could introduce coloration into the sound, and many people find that desirable. So it is often a common control, particularly on delays or echoes that are simulating vintage units. So people like the quality of that sound change. So let me just demonstrate that real quick. You see how those repeats of the note basically sound the same as the original note? Let's really turn up the tape mod to really exaggerate the effect. You see how our subsequent repeats were kind of more colored, distorted, affected. You may like that sound, you may not, but a lot of people associate it with pleasing vintage sounds. And then tape drive just adds some distortion that would happen as an artifact of those units. It's not super relevant for our discussion here. Some people just found it a pleasing sound. So that is basically echo or delay. You'll typically see controls for time, how long before you hear the delay or echo, feedback, how many times you hear it, often a control over the volume, and maybe some other controls that affect the characteristics of the sound. And depending on your unit, might just have time as a literal function of time, or it may be able to track that relative to a specific tempo and give you fixed beat intervals like a quarter note or an eighth note triplet. So that is echo, pretty simple. Let's go ahead and turn that off and look at reverb. So again, we're back to my, what we'd call a dry signal, an unaffected signal. Right, so you're really just hearing the guitar itself. And I'll go ahead and turn on the reverb, and the effect should be pretty noticeable to you. It is a key part of some genres of music. It's, of course, used all over the place in music because it can add a pleasing sound. But in a genre like surf music, it's kind of key for adding that wet sound. So right, immediately you hear some ambiance in the sound. You know, versus dry. And we don't hear it as distinct echo like we do with a delay unit. The sound is kind of smeared together. You just get all those kind of different audio inputs that give it that sense of space, like you're hearing it in a room. I'll kind of turn things up here. Right, and if you think of like rhythmic sounds in surf, if we hear versus right, it's a lot more atmospheric, and that gives that vibe to that form of music. But you know, vocals are almost always going to have some reverb on there because it just kind of adds a pleasing kind of smear to the sound. So a lot of reverb systems are just going to have a control for how much of it there is. This has some additional controls for how much does the sound decay, right? It has some filtering if you want to control what parts of the spectrum you're hearing with your reverb. Pre-delay, it's really just easiest to think of as like the first sounds you're hearing. But again, it's something that you want to just set according to your taste. And frequently you'll find a mix control, which is how much of the wet signal the affected signal will pass through versus the unaffected signal. Right, if we take it out completely, we're back to the basic guitar. Some effect, or all effect. Right, so we can use our low pass filter to take out those high frequencies, which might be metallic there. More muffled. Or we may want to reduce the bassiness to clear things out in the mix. Decay would be how much it lingers around. Kind of waves of reverb as it builds up there. Now there are a variety of different ways that reverb was created in the old days when these effects were invented. On many guitar amps of older generations, you'll find a spring reverb. They ran the sound through springs to get that characteristic effect, and that of course was key for surf music. It also could play the sound in a room, effectively get the reverb sound they were looking for, and metal plates were also used. So you'll often see a plate and hall switch, sometimes with a spring option too. And these are just simulating those different physical approaches to the creation of reverb. But they have slightly different sounds, which can be subtle depending on how you're doing it. So we've been listening to plate reverb. This would be hall reverb. Let's turn it up all the way and see if we can hear more difference. And this may depend a lot on how they've modeled it, but it's really a creative decision what character of sound you're looking for. So I've shown some surf examples because it's a prominent part of that genre characteristic part of the sound. Of course, it's used across many genres. Concert halls provide beautiful natural reverb. An orchestra, ambient types of music really rely on it to give it that kind of spacious, dreamy sound. So it can be used in many different ways. Of course, combine the effects. So it's a very powerful creative tool and pretty ubiquitous throughout music production. Let's shift back over to Adobe Premiere one last time to look at a slightly different type of reverb, one that you may often find in software packages. Alright, for the last look at reverb here, remember I drew you this beautiful picture. It's a detailed scientific representation of how sound would bounce around in a space, different reflections off the various surfaces hitting your ear at different times, which we interpret as reverb, the reverberation of all of those sounds. Now, when we were looking at those guitar effects, that was software which was actually modeling physical versions of those effects. Different physical devices like the spring or a plate that the sound would be fed through would give the feeling of that reverberation effect. But a different type of reverb effect called a convolution reverb tries to actually do a model of how sounds would bounce off of a real world space. So let's take a look at that here. Going to add a convolution reverb to our little Baccarat track. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this effect. While it's not represented as pretty as that, modeled guitar software, and I am of course not sponsored by any of these software companies mentioned. Not sponsored for Premiere, Reason, Arturia with their synthesizer, or Neural DSP with their plugin. Just a personal user here. We see some of the same factors, mix, see some low frequency and high frequency damping, pre-delay, width, which pertains to the stereo field, and then a gain value for controlling volume here. But we see something different. We get room size, and also something called an impulse here, which currently is set to classroom. Now, what is going on? Well, as I said, this is trying to simulate a physical space, and the impulse, usually with software like this, refers to they've sent some signal into this space and kind of recorded what would happen. They use that to create a model of what a given sound in that space might sound like. And so a convolution reverb is an attempt at simulating a physical space. And you'll usually have options for the type of space you are simulating. Let's just choose lecture hall. They happen to be called play. I guess since we're doing kind of a teaching course here. Just hand water, hand tube. And which do you think will win? So you might put your money on. Let's hear my raw voice. And once all bets are in, and let's turn on the reverb. 2 bands of 2 cards each, potentially a 3-card hand, depending on a certain set of rules. And the closest of those 2 hands to 9 will win. The dealer will bring up some volume there. And will pay out bets accordingly. So you can see how instead of being a more direct sound into the microphone, it now has that kind of boxier sound. It sounds a little bit more like I'm in a space where you're hearing some of those echoes. And our ears are very sensitive to that difference. We're used to identifying sound in space. We could do something different inside the shower. Right? Different audio character and width. Lots of people like the way their voice sounds in the shower because you're getting some natural reverb. Adds a little bit of that lushness. could go with massive cavern. Right, and here the voice is like completely lost. All of those reflections are kind of taking over. So we do have a control room size, which will reduce the feel of that because it'll make that room smaller, less dominated by those echoes. Very echoey. Gets more dry, less of the effect of that smaller room. And again, pre-delay, it's kind of like early delay in the signal. You should just listen for how these affect your sound. You have the gain here because having the sound more dominated by the echoes, we're kind of getting a perceived reduction in volume. So big room. Back to that very dry, direct into the mic voice. Alright, so that is a convolution reverb. Again, it has attempted a more physical model of a space. The goal of trying to create what that would actually sound like. I personally don't use them a lot. I often find the effect can be too much and you lose some of the original character of the sound. But that can depend a lot on the specific reverb that you're using and how you manipulate the settings. But it is another common form of reverb effect that you're likely to encounter and may want to use. Alright, so that is a look at time-based effects. The related topics of echo, delay, and reverb, which were about how we hear subsequent sounds after the initial sound, whether we're getting strong, discrete repeats, or a reverberant, kind of lush feeling of all of the different reflections of sound that we get in a reverb effect. And I'm going to stop there. As I said, these are huge topics. Hopefully this has been a helpful introduction to the basics of compression, the control of the volume of a sound, equalization, which is how we can affect different frequencies or pitches of a given audio, and time-based effects like reverb and delay, which can kind of expand the sound or give us a sense of ambiance, as well as having a role in particular creative effects. So please let me know if you found this helpful or have other questions you might like explored. I hope you can have some fun experimenting with these effects, and